So our own death, it's not something that people really like to think about. But when people do think about it, they like to think about going to some kind of heaven. Well, recently my wife and I were watching a movie called Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. And in the movie, there's a really great scene that challenges a very common misconception about heaven and how we get there. So let's talk about it. So the story of Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, I think it's a remake. It came out in 2022, but I think it's a remake of an older movie and even a book. So I don't really know how the story has changed, but it's about an older widow, Mrs. Harris, who she's part of the working class. She's a house cleaner. She goes from house to house, and everybody loves Mrs. Harris. But she falls in love with a dress. One of her clients has this Christian Dior dress made in Paris. It's a custom dress. It's absolutely beautiful. It's 500 pounds, you know, in terms of money. That's how the English talk about money. It's pounds or quid. But they, you know, it's super expensive dress. She falls in love with it because it's beautiful. And at the time, she thinks that maybe her husband's still alive. I won't go into the whole story, but she wants this dress because she thinks that she'll look beautiful in it for him. And that's really what kind of captivates her. So she saves all her money. She's collecting it all, got her whole life savings, and she's off to Paris to buy this Christian Dior dress. But once she gets there, she goes, she's wanting to go into the showroom where they're going to show all these different dresses, but there's kind of a gatekeeper there, and the gatekeeper won't even let her in. She looks down upon her as part of this working class. You're not even supposed to be in there, so she's not even allowed in. And it's this scene that really challenges a very common misconception about heaven and how we get there, and then it illustrates the truth. So let me tell you a little bit more about this scene. In the scene, Mrs. Harris, she's insulted. She's amazed that she's not even allowed into the showroom. And as she's trying to get in, all these other, you know, kind of upper class, really wealthy, well-dressed, very rich people start coming in, and it really causes a big scene as the gatekeeper's like, you don't belong here. You can't be here. And Mrs. Harris, she's so frustrated, and she starts to say, you know, everything that she's done to get there, and I've worked so hard. And then she even, you know, she's pulling out her money. She's saying, see, I even have the money. And the gatekeeper is still like, you're not getting in. And it really is heartbreaking if you kind of have the context of the whole story up to this point, as Mrs. Harris is frantically like pleading, you know, she's trying to pay her way in. She's pleading like, let me in to the showroom. But the gatekeeper won't have it until, and pardon my French because I'm not exactly sure how to say his name, until Marquis de Casson, or Casson. Again, I don't know how to speak French, but until this really wealthy man shows up who is clearly well respected by everyone who's at the scene. And what he does is so fascinating. He takes Mrs. Harris's money that she has set out for this dress to get into the showroom, and puts it aside. And then he offers her his arm and says, you know, will you be my guest? And Mrs. Harris takes his arm, and the gatekeeper's amazed at this, that he is willing to take her into the showroom, and everyone else is like, what's happening right now? And the Marquis, he offers his arm, and he takes her in there, and they go into this showroom, and it's kind of this, you know, it's a place that inspires beauty and elegance, as one by one these models come in wearing these beautiful dresses, and it kind of is a picture of the way life should be, you know, elevated and beautiful. And so here's where there's a common misconception about heaven. I want you to think about this kind of like a metaphor, okay? Consider you and I as Mrs. Harris. right? And we're wanting to get into the showroom, which is heaven, right? And I don't know what your views are on heaven and the afterlife, but if there is one, I know that you want to go there, right? And so many people approach this as a, well, I'm going to just try to be a good person. We kind of view it as like the point system. Like if you've seen The Good Place, it's like I want to get enough good points that outweigh all of my bad points so that, so that I can get into the good place. But that's not how it works. The truth is, and so well illustrated at this scene, is that you cannot plead your way in. You cannot pay your way in. You can only get in if you are with Jesus. He is the only one that allows you to get in the same way that Mrs. Harris could not get into the showroom except as the guest of the marquee. We cannot get into heaven unless we are the guest of Jesus himself. I mean, heaven is the place where God is, and God is holy, and He is so good. It's too good for us to even be in His presence. And kind of the showroom gatekeeper, in a sense, even understands that you don't belong there. You can't be there. But you get into heaven only if you are with Jesus and you're clothed. I mean, this is kind of the bottom line here. Good people don't go to heaven. Only people with God's grace go to heaven. I mean, you want to go to heaven, but what you really want is the grace of God, because that's the only way that you can get into that place. So this idea of grace, it gets played out further in the movie. And I don't know if this is intentional or unintentional, but either way, it's amazing because Mrs. Harris, after all the events of the movie, she finally has her dress and she goes back home and she hasn't even worn it yet. And this young girl that she's acquaintances with comes to her and she's upset because, she's supposed to go to this big ball, this big party thing, and she doesn't have anything to wear. So Mrs. Harris, she takes her dress and she offers it to the girl. And that's another thing that we learn about grace, is that once you've received it, you realize that you want to share it. You want other people to experience that. And so Mrs. Harris, she gives her dress to this young girl, and this young girl, she's so undeserving. She takes it and she goes to the party. She ends up ruining it. It totally gets burned. And it's a point in the movie where it's sad because she's spent everything. Mrs. Harris has spent everything for this dress, and now she doesn't have anything to show for it, even though she's never worn it. Well, back at Christian Dior's, place, where they make these dresses, they end up hearing the news of this. They end up designing this even more beautiful dress, and they send it, and the marquee sends flowers, and so Mrs. Harris opens this package, and it's this new dress and all these flowers, and she realizes, and we realize that when you've received grace and you give grace, it doesn't go away. And in the same way, when we receive grace from God, we in turn can share that grace with others, and that we continue to have it. It's grace upon grace. It continues to compound on one another so that we will not be put to shame. So this is just a really interesting movie. I'm not necessarily recommending it unless you like this type of movie, but I want you to see this kind of scene. We only get into heaven by the grace of God, and the grace of God only comes when you believe in Jesus, when you accept His invitation to take His arm and to walk into that showroom, to walk into heaven, and to walk into that place where life is as it should be. And why do we love movies like this? Because it's true. This is true. This is the true story, and it can be your story if you believe in Jesus. That's my hope for you.